Thank you. Thank you, Preeti, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's a privilege to be here. Yeah, okay. So, Visions of Order and Antiquity, Palimpsests and Invention in Banaras. And this is a project that I've been working on for a few years now. And I will try and give you a kind of summary of a lot of detail that is going to show up in the book. Okay? So, most visitors to the North Indian pilgrimage center of Banaras, also known by the names Kashi and Varanasi, expect to find a city of ancient temples and ritual sites along the sacred Ganges. Continuously inhabited for 2,000 years, the quintessential Hindu city. These are some general truisms used to describe Banaras. A rich textual corpus in Sanskrit and various regional vernacular languages sustains such narratives, supported by a thriving religious life of pilgrimage routes and festivals in a built environment of temples, riverfront edifices, and monasteries. As the subject of numerous pilgrimage maps, paintings, and photographs, images of hoary antiquity are reinforced through visual media. Yet, as one takes a closer look at this city, there are hints of a more complex story. The riverfront ghats bear an uncanny resemblance to the Mughal fortress palaces that line the Jamuna River at Delhi and Agra. One of the city's most significant institutions, the Sampurnanand Sanskrit University, is housed in a Gothic revival-style building, more reminiscent of a college in 19th century Britain than a traditional Indian Gurukul. No significant building on the riverfront can be dated to earlier than the year 1600, and the city's skyline is punctuated by two visually dominant 17th century mosques. Kashi may be an ancient city, but it is a reconstructed Banaras that contemporary pilgrims and visitors encounter. Much evidence for the city's antiquity is derived from textual sources that have viewed themselves as static and ahistorical. This perspective, in turn, has a basis in general impressions of the city as eternal, timeless, unchanging, that are simultaneously and contradictorily sustained through popular and scholarly accounts of the repeated rebuilding after several instances of invasion and destruction at the hands of Islamic rulers. These repeated assaults purportedly begin with the Ghurids in the 12th century and end with the specific policies and actions of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in the 17th century. The presence of significant mosques lends credence to such theories, and although many scholars agree that Banaras underwent an upheaval after the Ghurid encounters, the precise nature of this shift is still debated. Okay. So they observe, for instance, that many features of its sacred landscape, such as the practice of pilgrimage routes around the Vishweshwar temple, evolved after the 12th century. Yet, these new elements and their religious, textual, and spatial characteristics are rarely, if ever, discussed in historical terms. Textual references to Banaras can be traced back at least till the 6th century of the Common Era. However, even a preliminary critical overview of the textual corpus reveals that despite certain shared elements, such as ideas about a boundary and a center, the authors of each text held differing views on the overall configuration as well as details of its sacred landscape. At least since the 12th century, its ritual geography was conceptualized as a sacred zone, Kashi Kshetra, spreading outward from its physical and ritual center, a linga, the aniconic symbol of the Hindu deity Shiva. This geography was the basis of a pilgrimage zone that existed simultaneously as imagined configuration as well as lived experience. If authors of religious texts defined it as an idealized circle or square, in practice, the extents and contours of this zone were always irregular and contingent. Moreover, the identity of the central anchoring Shivalinga remained on shifting ground, altered and adjusted through the centuries. Philological analyses suggest that ideas regarding a sacred zone centered on a Vishweshwar Linga, so, the specific Vishweshwar Linga, were first conceptualized and summarized in a Sanskrit text called the Kashi Khanda. A compendium of pilgrimage routes, individual sacred sites, and their related myths, this text was actually composed as late as the 14th century. Significantly, the Kashi Khanda does not contain any mention of the outermost pilgrimage route, the Panchkroshi. And you see a kind of, schematic representation of the Panchkroshi, and that is I'll come back to this kind of map that I created, where kind of this is the real Panchkroshi and this is a later imagination of the Panchkroshi, kind of extending that idea. And the Panchkroshi, right, it both surrounds Banaras and by extension also the Vishweshwar Linga. This route, the Panchkroshi, was mentioned in pilgrimage texts only as late as the 15th century and was first described in some detail in a 16th century Sanskrit text, the Kashi Rahasya. Since then, successive generations of Brahmin scholars have assessed and reinterpreted the Kashi Khanda as well as the Kashi Rahasya. In subsequent centuries, both texts were incorporated into the Purana textual literature on the city, and the prescriptions contained within each were folded into the formal canon of pilgrimage and ritual worship connected with Kashi Kshetra. As Wendy Doniger and Velcheru Narayan Rao have explicated, folk narratives or texts were often folded into the enveloping narrative of a Purana text. Such augmentation could indicate the fact that a localized tradition or practice had been incorporated into an encompassing Brahminical social and narrative structure. In essence, both the Kashi Khanda, now incorporated within the Skanda Purana, and the Kashi Rahasya, now incorporated within the Brahma Vaivarta Purana, are spatial texts. Their authors were preoccupied with the significance of sacred sites and also their location and physical disposition. The merger of these texts with the formula Purana tradition had consequences for the city's spaces and its built environment. The continued reinterpretations, in particular those undertaken between the 15th and 19th centuries, were the basis for the city's evolving sacred landscape over the past 4 centuries, as a temple dedicated to house the Vishweshwar Linga was visualized as a central and monumental manifestation of its connection to Shiva. The city's riverfront was a visible marker of its role as a site for ritual cleansing and cremation, and patrons reinforced this role through spectacular architecture. Besides texts, pilgrimage pata, such as the one you see here, schematic charts in a sense, and maps were powerful tools that allowed pilgrims to visualize complex connections described within texts. The spatial dimensions and characteristics of sacred zones and pilgrimage routes could be conveyed through a single painting or map and had the advantage of being accessible as a collection of easily comprehended images and symbols. Their creators adapted a variety of pictorial and cartographic devices from the larger context of Mughal and subsequently colonial survey techniques and visual representation, suggesting the existence of a continually evolving relationship between the religious imagination and its contingent political and cultural contexts. Patronage was key to the gradual development of ritual and spatial practices, as in the case of specific pilgrimage routes and, of course, for temples and monasteries. So to understand the city's evolution in historical terms, I rely on the earliest architectural vestiges of its sacred landscape, the most significant of which are datable to the reign of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. Mughal state patronage and state-sponsored interventions between the late 16th and early 18th centuries shaped the religious environment of Banaras, including its principal shrines such as the temple dedicated to Vishweshwar, as well as the edifices built along the city's riverfront that lent this space a distinct character. So I should also point out that what you see here are the remnants of the Mughal temple of Vishweshwar, dismantled during Aurangzeb's reign, but also erected during the reign of Akbar. And I will return to this concept complex. I use the term state-sponsored to indicate tacit support provided by the Mughal state through land grants, substantiated in many cases by farmans, as well as to the enabling role of the Mughal mansabdar that many high-ranking Hindu courtiers flaunted through architectural patronage. As Catherine Asher has explained, these roles reinforce the authority of a multi-layered Mughal governance structure where imperial, familial, and individual interests were closely aligned and mutually reinforced. Subsequent Mughal interventions during the reign of the Emperor Aurangzeb also resulted in the creation of the city's most prominent mosques. Through direct imperial actions, the Gyanvapi Mosque was built to replace the Vishweshwar temple, and you see the dome of the mosque there, and the Dharhara Mosque to replace the Bindu Madhav temple. Aurangzeb was keen to establish new norms for his reign, which included a redefinition of the relationship between the emperor, his court, as well as his subjects. His interventions in Banaras may be more accurately analyzed in light of a personal and political agenda rather than as mere expressions of religious bigotry. Subsequent histories of rebuilding and tensions around the proximity of temple and mosque in the heart of the city have shaped its sacred landscape. Their adjacent sites have been framed as both the result as well as cause of unadulterated antagonism between Hindus and Muslims, even though this proximity could just as easily be viewed as being the result of a compromise or even a shared notion of sacred space. The twin and somewhat simplistic accounts of timelessness and destruction, centered as they tend to be on the architectural history of Banaras, as manifest in its most visible mosques, become general narratives about Indian, read Hindu, civilizations and its vicissitudes at the whims of Muslim invaders and rulers. Moreover, the specter of Islamic destruction looms far beyond actual instances of disruption instigated by Indo-Islamic regimes. A closer examination of complex interventions by successive regimes, as well as their place within collective memories and representations, reveal a more nuanced story. Throughout the late 16th and 17th century, the Ganges was a significant transportation route connecting the plains of northern India to urban centers in Bengal, and appearance and visibility from the river remained a major consideration for the proprietors and builders of riverfront sites in Banaras. Even so, the riverfront in the late 16th century was a relatively sparsely built and yet ritually significant space, and Mughal interest and intervention altered both its built environment as well as its sacred cartography. By the late 16th century, the riverfront fortress palace was a symbol of centralized political and cultural authority. Consequently, mansions and fortress palaces were gradually added along the ritually significant riverfront, often at sites with deep textual histories. Notably, the Mughal state owned large swaths of land in Banaras. All private ownership along the river's edge, as elsewhere in the city, was ratified through Mughal farmans. Further, new edifices had the potential to combine the potency of a ritual site with the political overtones of architectural symbolism. Mughal architecture also reflected the political and cultural agenda of each emperor. Their enthusiastic engagement with Iranian forms and precedents could be replaced with a very studied indifference to these forms, as individual emperors in turn addressed domestic preoccupations or competed on the global stage of the early modern Islamic world. Their courtiers and mansabdars were equally alive to the opportunities provided by such cosmopolitan options. In a general sense, Hindu mansabdars at the Mughal court simultaneously straddled and molded Mughal courtly culture while fashioning themselves as pious Hindus. So when Man Singh Kachwaha, Raja of Amber, constructed the Man Mandir around the year 1600, that's the Man Mandir, he intervened in the ritual geography of the Dashashwamedh Ghat. The Man Mandir Haveli reflected late 16th century imperial tastes with its architecture of columns, beams, brackets, carved stonework, based on the regional elite architecture of Western India. The Mughal ceremony of the imperial darshan was symbolically recreated at the Man Mandir. With their intimate connection to the Mughal imperial family, the Kachwas were permitted to employ the symbolism of the Jharoka. And you see Jharokas all over the Man Mandir. A privilege otherwise reserved for imperial structures, indicating an extension of political authority. By the mid-18th century, as Mughal hegemony began to recede, the city became part of the territories of their autonomous regional governors, the Nawabs of Awadh. And at Banaras, a Hindu chief called Mansa Ram first challenged and then replaced Mir Rustam Ali, their representative. The Marathas, a federation based in central India, gained control over large parts of South Asia and were also interested in gaining control over principal Hindu pilgrimage centers, including Banaras. By 1781, the Vishweshwar temple was rebuilt by Ahilyabai Holkar, the Maratha ruler of Malwa, on a site adjacent to its original late 16th century location. So, if that's the Gyanvapi Mosque and the Mughal temple or the remnants of the Mughal temple are behind it, this was Ahilyabai's Vishweshwar temple, which is the current central node in the city. Significant elements that define the city's architectural and urban character were also added over the course of the 18th century. These new temples and their associated ritual traditions were overlaid on an existing sacred landscape and augmented it in complex and often spectacular ways. The fortress palace or riverfront mansion acquired new meanings in this altered political and cultural climate, a fact recognized by Ahilyabai when she added a mansion connected to a Brahmapuri and a temple at the southern limits of the Dashashwamedh Ghat. So, if this is, and many of you are very familiar with Banaras, this is Ahilyabai's Ghat, and the Man Mandir is right there. So, at one time, this was all the Dashashwamedh Ghat. Right? The design for Ahilyabai's mansion, or Wada in Maratha parlance, reinforced as well as altered the symbolism of the site. Like Man Singh before her, Ahilyabai chose this site because of its place within the limits of the venerated Dashashwamedh Ghat. Yet, once these buildings were built, they acquired independent identities and were no longer considered part of the older Ghat. Dashashwamedh was divided into three parts that would now include the Ahilya, Dashashwamedh, and Man Mandir Ghats in sequence. Ahilyabai Holkar, however, was a different kind of patron than her Mughal predecessor, Man Singh Kachwa. Groomed by her father-in-law, Malla Rao Holkar, to act as regent of Malwa after his death, she combined and successfully projected the twin attributes of powerful ruler and pious widow. These contradictory qualities and therefore complex motivations are reflected in the design of the Ahilyabai Wada. Although visible as an imposing building from the riverfront, the building has an appearance of studied austerity. It was planned as a two-storied structure around a sparsely embellished courtyard. Unlike other buildings of similar size that had patrons of a similar stature, the Wada did not have any designated spaces of elite pleasure, such as a baradari on its terrace. In late Mughal circles, elite men could use a baradari, literally pavilion with 12 doors, with its ornate arches and pillars as a social space for evening soirees. They would be entertained by poets, usually female dancers, and musicians. Its associations were therefore pleasurable as well as slightly risque. While courtesans, accompanied by entourages, could make their way to a baradari by invitation, elite women were usually confined to the more private and restricted areas of a mansion, usually the apartments around the zanana courtyard. In keeping with their social status and public image of respectability, elite women usually also avoided the rooftop soirees enjoyed by their male relatives. So a widow who led an army and frequented circles of power could find herself in a difficult and contradictory position. She was required to simultaneously project an image of authority while maintaining the status and aura of a well-bred and modest lady who, but for adverse circumstances, could have remained sheltered within the female quarters of her mansion. Ahilyabai bridged this difficulty by cultivating an image of sober respectability, consistent with cultural expectations. At the same time, she projected a public persona of generous piety and patronage. Her religious building program extended across the subcontinent, and she was concerned primarily with reviving places of Hindu and particularly Shaiva pilgrimage. Within Banaras, the Vishweshwar temple was prominently and visibly associated with her munificence. Significantly, spaces within the Ahilyabai Vada are conspicuously plain and austere, with a careful avoidance of suggestive ornamentation or decorative details that could be read as indicators of a dissipated or even luxurious lifestyle. Ahilyabai sponsored construction of a Brahmapuri to the immediate south of her mansion, and it was designed to house 60 Brahmin priests and their families. So all that is the Brahmapuri. Just that is the mansion, and the temple next to it. The adjacent location of the Brahmapuri and its connection to the mansion was enhanced through architectural design that united the facades of the two buildings. And you don't see that unification now anymore because people have altered the facade, but older engravings and prints do show that connection. When viewed from a boat, they read as a single, plain but imposing structure adjoining a significant ghat. Besides the charitable act of constructing and endowing a Brahmapuri that enhanced her reputation as a pious patron, the combination of imposing facade and minimal architectural detailing underlined an image of simplicity and frugality. In the design for the temple attached to the ghat, however, Ahilyabai's designers created a more ornate building. Since temples had divine associations, their decorative exteriors did not adversely affect the image their patron might otherwise carefully cultivate. Indeed, their embellishments and expensive building materials could favorably proclaim their patron's piety and devotion. Beginning in 1781, British intervention in Banaras extended to its ritual landscape. As East India Company official Jonathan Duncan, who was appointed in 1787, began to institute centralized forms predicated on an idea of a general public good for a city of responsible and uniformly governed citizens, he began to intervene in kind of the, both the urban landscape as well as the ritual landscape of Banaras. His administration began to levy citywide taxation, beginning with a tax on every new idol installed in a temple. Taking the idea of uniform governance further, the company tried to institute a citywide house tax in 1811. Each of these measures was largely unpopular and met with varied degrees and displays of collective resistance. Duncan also began to establish institutional and administrative mechanisms that would lie beyond the purview of established networks of patronage and power, and to this end, he intervened in the city's academic institutions. Hitherto, Brahmin scholars had taught students who became a part of their households, resulting in strong bonds of patronage, familial ties, and individual mentorship that perpetuated the city's academic legacy. Duncan's intention was to shift patronage for Sanskrit learning away from, quote, native princes and to the company, to which end he established the Sanskrit Pathshala in 1791. The institution was also intended as a training ground for Indian experts in what he saw as Hindu law, who would eventually assist European judges in dispensing authentic forms of justice. Taken together, Duncan's actions had wide-reaching implications for civic identity, the economy of patronage, and the city's ritual landscape. Duncan and his contemporaries eagerly embraced Orientalist notions and antiquarian perspectives on Benares. They viewed it as an authentic Hindu artifact, a subject for intellectual investigation that was to be preserved, much in the same way that antique objects were being collected, displayed, and preserved throughout the company's expanding dominions. Positivist historical perspectives were also promoted through the Asiatic Society, established in 1784, an association of amateur colonial historians and dilettantes based in Calcutta. The Society's activities and publications triggered a discourse through which Indians began to imagine their past in new ways. The discovery of the Buddhist site of Sarnath, widely accepted as the site of the Buddha's first sermon, to the north of Kashi Kshetra, so beyond the Panchkroshi circuit, in 1794, altered the city's history as well as its imagined geography. Sarnath became pivotal to the story of Banaras. As the colonial apparatus continued to produce a historical timeline for the subcontinent, the Puranas were consigned to a medieval age and were no longer sufficient sources for authenticating its antiquity. Indian, notably Hindu visitors in particular, endeavored to close this gap between a rooted view of the past and the demands of new historical perspectives. A Bengali visitor, he eventually also became a member of the Asiatic Society, Bholanath Chandar, commented dolefully on the absence of visible signs of antiquity and observed with disappointment that, quote, the oldest building dates only from the age of Akbar, end quote. If historical accounts had to be supported by physical vestiges as substantive proof that Banaras was indeed an ancient city, instances of Islamic iconoclasm could also explain the glaring lack of ancient pre-Islamic remains rooted in Purana accounts. For such an argument to be convincing, the location as well as religious antecedents of Sarnath had to be reconciled with the city's Purana-based ritual geography. To accomplish this successfully, Chandar, along with many of his contemporaries, accepted Buddhism as integral to a monolithic Hindu faith. He incorporated Sarnath within an imagined ancient city that extended well beyond its mid-19th century limits. An unlikely example of an observant and orthodox Hindu, if Chandar ever took a dip in the Ganges or prayed at the Vishweshwar temple, he was silent on the subject. The city's Brahmins, on the other hand, seemed reluctant to ascribe Buddhist origins to Hindu practices, and Chandar accused them of, quote, craftiness and also ignorance for espousing narrow beliefs and concerns. These views were included in the city's official colonial gazetteer written by H.R. Neville and published by 1905. Neville now declared that the first historical age was connected with the life of the Buddha, confirmed by the excavations at Sarnath. He then enumerated the reigns of several Muslim dynasties and emphasized the repeated destruction of the Vishweshwar temple, beginning with the first instance in 1194 by Qutubuddin Aibak and the latest instance by Aurangzeb in 1669. He concluded with the establishment of a ruling Hindu house in Banaras under the benign protection of British hegemony. Authors of popular guidebooks, whether British or Indian, could more easily accept a fluid relationship between history and myth. Major Herbert Newell, an officer in the colonial army, produced a guidebook for Banaras in 1915, in which he presented legends as well as histories, accompanied by a tour that started with the city's principal shrines, continued to the riverfront, and concluded with a tour of Sarnath. He was careful to include living legends and emphasize their association with the tangible built environment that visitors would encounter. In the construction of a popular discourse for the city, the mythical viewpoint lost neither its appeal nor its adherence. All through the 19th century, the rapid urbanization and increasingly cosmopolitan culture of colonial centers such as Calcutta or Kolkata and Bombay, below Mumbai, left Banaras with a provincial identity, a fact that visitors and residents alike noted with disappointment. Besides the dearth of visible signs of antiquity, visitors such as Chandar were disappointed by the absence of modern institutions and spaces such as art galleries, mansions, museums, and public libraries. He bemoaned the lack of a modern built environment, as well as the absence of public institutions that could embody a collective history, complaining, quote, "There is no such scene as a Hindu Westminster Abbey, in which repose the most remarkable men of Hindu history," end quote, whoever those may be, right? Celebrations and spectacles that were initiated mere decades earlier, such as the Ganesh feast by the Maratha Peshwas, left Chandar unimpressed and even disgusted. A new building built for the Sanskrit Pathshala, now the Queen's College, by Kitto in 1852, set fresh expectations among the city's Hindu elite. It catered to an idealized vision of Hindu scholastic tradition, with students and teachers seated cross-legged on carpets, ensconced within a building and setting that recalled, quote, the gardens of Oxford and Cambridge, end quote. Chandar hoped the building would, quote, enlighten and form the native population into a new Hindu nation with new ideas in their heads and new institutions distinguishing their national character, end quote. However, for most Indian elites, although Banaras was to be transformed, it was simultaneously to retain its ritual significance as well as palpable antiquity. Sustaining its sacred geography and ritual life were abiding concerns, as was the desire for spaces and buildings that could compare favorably with the edifices, esplanades, and parks of Calcutta and Bombay. Bharatendu Harishchandra, right, also known as the father of modern Hindi, articulated these concerns in 1874 in his play Prem Jogini. One of his characters, a Brahmin, describes Banaras to a fellow traveler who he meets at a railway station in another town, the town of Mughalsarai, actually. The Brahmin dwells on the city's role as a pilgrimage destination, but is equally concerned with its colleges, libraries, and hospitals. He enumerates deities mentioned in the Puranas, colonial officials, and the city's contemporary elite in almost the same breath, and takes his audience on a verbal tour of the riverfront, Sarnath, the Queen's College, as well as, quote, the Golden Dome of the Vishweshwar Temple. Taken together, these sites merely strengthen the city's description in the Puranas as unique in three worlds. In this climate, elites supported the construction of the Prince of Wales Hospital in 1865 and a town hall in 1876. By the turn of the 20th century, the intersection of colonial regulation, antiquarian sensibilities, and Indian desires also reshaped the ritual imagination, cartographies, and landscapes of Banaras. Alterations to the Panchkroshi route were overseen by a colonial government determined to fix a correct profile for the pilgrimage. The city had been successfully and successively surveyed by the colonial government in 1867-68, 1879-80, then again in 1883, and then yet again in 1928-29. And surveyors emphasized the desire for a greater degree of accuracy in mapping techniques. Surveys either preceded or accompanied large-scale and intrusive urban planning measures, transportation projects, or infrastructure projects. Expectations of precision and accuracy engendered through colonial surveys meant that the Panchkroshi route was expected to align with the perfect geometry of Kashi Kshetra. An elite committee of bankers and landowners that the British city magistrate Gubbins convened around 1842 or so, was charged with addressing the purity and accuracy of the route. The committee was also charged with devising ways to enhance and develop infrastructure for pilgrims. Pandit Bapudev Shastri, a Brahmin scholar at the Queen's College, acted as an expert consultant. His Shastra-based expertise strengthened the committee's resolve to realign the Panchkroshi route as a perfect circle, or at the very least, at least as a partially perfect arc. What was the cumulative effect of such alterations on the cartographic imagination and representation of Kashi Kshetra? Through the incorporation of colonial surveys, or at least by making references to them, Brahmin priests claimed greater precision in their own mapping exercises. By the late 19th century, several pilgrimage maps were lithographed and sold at major bookshops and at the railway station to take advantage of increased pilgrimage traffic to the city. The desire for precision was accompanied by an urgent need to establish an objective but Purana-based antiquity for the ritual landscape of Kashi Kshetra. So Kailasnath Sukul produced a lithographed map that you see on the right in 1876 that he titled the Kashi Darpana, Mirror of Kashi, in which he combined ideas about a perfectly delineated circular Panchkroshi. The map's authenticity was emphasized through a dual invocation of Puranas, and he lists the Puranas here. It's, because it's, I've oriented it this way, but he would orient it, right, with east being upwards. So the Puranas he quotes are the Linga Purana, Shiv Puran, Nandi Puran, Skanda Puran, Ganesh Puran, Agni Puran, and the Kashi Khand as sources of religious information and colonial survey techniques as guarantors of spatial accuracy and precision. The Ganges marked the western edge of the city, and Sukul included contemporary Banaras with selected buildings such as the town hall and the Bhosla mansion and ghat. The Kashi Darpana also set a precedent for depicting a Panchkroshi imagined as a perfect circle, a ring of shrines around the city at sites that their authors claimed had been accurately surveyed and located. Sukul labeled the circle as the Brihad Panchkroshi, Greater Panchkroshi, a route that circled the entire city and spanned either side of the Ganges River. Its center was located in the shrine of Madhyameshwar in the Muhalla of the same name, a location shared by Purana definitions of the Kashi Kshetra. In practice, however, the older route remained the preferred one, except for the limited changes effected by Shastri and the governance committee. Unlike writers such as Chandar or Harishchandra, Sukul refrained from including Sarnath. His vision was strictly based on interpretations of the Puranas, and by extension, an orthodox Hinduism. However, Sarnath lay well within the extents of the circular and enlarged Panchkroshi. So even though he didn't identify it, it was circled by the Brihad Panchkroshi. It is also pertinent that the outer extents of the circular route, depicted in the Kashi Darpana, could encompass the location of Sarnath without any acknowledgement of the site itself. The Brahmin-oriented Purana perspective remained at odds with the new vision of an all-encompassing Hinduism based in shared cultural sensibilities that could also be the basis for a national identity. Authors such as Sukul found a way to selectively appropriate the antiquity of Sarnath without making overt references to its Buddhist associations. Yet, other strategies were also available. In 1796, for instance, the British landscape artist Thomas Daniel produced an illustration of the newly built Dashashwamedh Ghat, Ahilyabai's Ghat, that faced the river. In Daniel's image, a monumental stone mansion is approached by a flight of equally monumental stone steps. The scene is dotted with boats, cows, figures of natives. His buildings are imbued with a nostalgic grandeur and monumentality. And in his text, A Picturesque Voyage to India, the artist found that Indian buildings were, quote, often elucidated by the manners of the present inhabitants, who with unexampled fidelity have preserved their primitive customs, unimpaired by time or conquest, and in their domestic institutions still present the image of a remote and almost obsolete antiquity. Daniel's illustration effectively consigned a contemporary landscape to the past. The picturesque in Britain had been used to aestheticize real economic inequities sharpened by agricultural capitalism in implementation of enclosures and visible traces of modernity. In those depictions, ruins predominated, and a sense of stasis pervaded depictions, which meant that the picturesque landscape always depicted the past rather than the present. The idiom was often used to depict buildings like ruined castles and abbeys, landscape from a remote past that could be contemplated and simultaneously observed through nostalgia and detachment. In a colonial environment, and many people have written, on this topic, the picturesque intersected with an Orientalist viewpoint and allowed artists to treat contemporary indigenous subjects as well as their environments as exotic objects in an equally strange landscape that had already been conceived of as belonging in the past. The riverfront at Banaras, with its monumental architecture, its masses of people, was just such an ideal subject. With temples, ghats, palaces, it provided ample material for picturesque representations. And descriptions and illustrations by colonial travelers and artists were often centered on the Shashwamedh and Manikarnika ghats. This inherently manufactured nature of the picturesque, as well as its association with antiquity, or at least a semblance of antiquity, was adroitly adapted and enhanced by the Indian artist Sitaram. Sitaram was a protege of the Marquis of Hastings, Governor General of Bengal between 1813 and 23. And Sitaram traveled with his patron on a trip up the Ganges from Calcutta and on to Agra and Delhi in 1814. He produced a number of watercolors that are preserved in a set of albums called the Hastings Albums, commissioned as mementos for the Governor General's children. Building on the premises of the colonial picturesque, Sitaram went a step further. When he created a view of the riverfront at Banaras, he combined architectural elements from various buildings along the stretch along Manikarnika Ghat to create a pair of fictitious buildings that he titled, quote, the Temple of Raja Dasarath, with the house he lived in to the left, end quote. In representing Dasharath, character from the Hindu epic the Ramayana, Sitaram directly construed a landscape that maintained concrete visual connections to an actual built environment, but was associated with a mythical yet relevant character from a story that was performed every year during the annual Ram Leela celebrations in Banaras. For Sitaram, the picturesque mode persisted as a powerful instrument to reinforce an antique Hindu identity for Banaras. The riverfront could as easily become an object of interest for the Orientalist photographer, in much the same manner as it had been for the artist of the picturesque. So it was a popular halt on the 19th century colonial photographer's itinerary, and an early example includes Samuel Bourne's photographs for the riverfront, right, in 1865. An album of 41 prints presented to prominent British visitors by the Maharaja of Banaras, Prabhu Narayan Singh, in 1921, included photographic prints of the riverbank, but also contained images of a new civic building such as the town hall, public hospitals, the stupa at Sarnath, as well as antiquities unearthed during new excavations at the site that were conducted in 1905. Authors of guidebooks from the early 20th century began to incorporate photographs as well as employ similar strategies. Photo albums and guidebooks could bypass the constraints of geography that were less easily avoided in a map. The question of whether Sarnath lay within or beyond the Panchkroshi circuit could be avoided. Geographically disparate and often contextually unrelated images could be combined within shared covers and tied together through narrative. The city could be viewed as both ancient and modern, its many layers contradictorily representing a timeless quality. The grids of universal cartography and global history modified narratives based in sectarian beliefs and timeless mythologies, but also became the basis for defining a refreshed Hindu identity. Thank you.